What if I told you that a single strand of hair could solve a murder that had haunted a community for nearly 4 decades? What if that same piece of evidence could finally give a mother the answers she had been desperately seeking since 1978? Before we dive into this incredible story of persistence, science, and ultimate justice, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because today's case will leave you questioning everything you think you know about cold cases. This is the story of Steven Johnson, an 18-year-old baseball star whose disappearance in Mobile County, Alabama became one of the most puzzling mysteries of the 20th century. April 15, 1978 started like any other spring day in Mobile County, Alabama. The dogwood trees were blooming, the air was warm with the promise of summer, and 18-year-old Steven Johnson had baseball on his mind. Steven wasn't just any teenager. He was the kind of young man that made parents proud and coaches dream of championship seasons. Standing 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair and an infectious smile, Steven had earned a reputation as one of the most promising baseball players in the county. That Saturday morning, Steven had plans, big plans. He was scheduled to meet his girlfriend, Linda, at the local diner for lunch, and later that evening, his baseball team had practice for their upcoming tournament. Steven was the kind of person who never missed commitments. His friends knew they could count on him. His coaches respected his dedication, and his mother, Margaret Johnson, had raised him to be responsible and reliable. But Steven had one problem that morning. His bicycle, his primary mode of transportation, had developed an issue with the chain. For most teenagers, this might have meant asking for a ride or walking to their destination. But Steven was determined to fix the problem himself. He had heard about a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town, run by a mechanic named Robert Coldwell. The shop had a reputation for being able to fix just about anything with wheels, and Steven figured that someone who could repair cars could certainly help him with his bicycle. Margaret Johnson watched from the kitchen window as her son wheeled his bicycle down their driveway that morning. She called out to him, asking where he was headed, and Steven turned back with that characteristic grin of his. "Just getting my bike fixed, Mom. I'll be back in time for lunch." Those would be the last words Margaret would ever hear her son speak. Robert Coldwell's auto repair shop sat on a lonely stretch of road about 3 miles outside the main part of town. It was the kind of place that locals knew about but visitors might easily miss. The shop was surrounded by tall pine trees and sat back from the road, making it somewhat isolated from the busier parts of Mobile County. Coldwell himself was a 42-year-old man who had been running the shop for several years. He was known in the community as someone who kept to himself, did decent work, and didn't cause any trouble. When Steven Johnson pedaled his bicycle up the gravel driveway to Coldwell's shop that Saturday morning, he had no way of knowing that he was about to become the victim of a crime that would baffle investigators for decades. He had no way of knowing that his mother would spend the next 37 years of her life wondering what had happened to him. And he certainly had no way of knowing that his case would eventually be solved by a microscopic piece of evidence that wouldn't be discovered until the 21st century. According to what investigators would later piece together, Steven arrived at the repair shop sometime around 10:30 that morning. Coldwell was working on a car in the main bay of the shop, and Steven approached him about getting help with his bicycle chain. What happened next remained a mystery for nearly 4 decades, but the end result was clear: Steven Johnson never left that repair shop alive. By noon, when Steven failed to show up for his lunch date with Linda, his girlfriend began to worry. Steven was never late, and he always called if his plans changed. She tried calling the Johnson house, but Margaret hadn't heard from Steven since he left that morning to get his bicycle repaired. By 2 o'clock, both Linda and Margaret were genuinely concerned. By 4 o'clock, when Steven failed to show up for baseball practice, his coach was making phone calls. Margaret Johnson spent that Saturday evening driving through Mobile County, looking for any sign of her son or his bicycle. She stopped at gas stations, convenience stores, and anywhere else a teenager might go. She asked friends, neighbors, and strangers if they had seen Steven, As the sun set on April 15, 1978, Margaret Johnson knew in her heart that something terrible had happened to her boy. The Mobile County Sheriff's Department received the missing person report on Stephen Johnson at 8:47 on Sunday morning, April 16. Deputy Sheriff James Martinez was assigned to the case, and he began his investigation with the standard protocol for missing teenagers. In 1978, it wasn't uncommon for young people to disappear for a day or two, especially if they had gotten into some kind of trouble or had run away from home. But as Martinez began interviewing Stephen's friends and family, it became clear that this was not a typical runaway situation. Everyone who knew Stephen Johnson described him the same way: responsible, reliable, and deeply connected to his family and friends. His girlfriend Linda told Deputy Martinez that Stephen had been excited about their lunch plans, and had even mentioned wanting to take her to a movie that evening. His baseball coach explained that Stephen never missed practice and was looking forward to the upcoming tournament. His mother Margaret provided a detailed account of Stephen's activities and mood in the days leading up to his disappearance, emphasizing that he had shown no signs of wanting to run away or leave town. The search for Stephen Johnson began in earnest on Monday morning. Deputy Martinez organized search parties that included local volunteers, fellow students from Stephen's high school, and members of his baseball team. They combed through the wooded areas around Mobile County, checked abandoned buildings, and followed up on every tip that came in through the sheriff's department. The local newspaper ran Stephen's photograph on the front page, and radio stations broadcast descriptions of the missing teenager throughout the region. One of the most promising leads came from a gas station attendant who remembered seeing a young man with a bicycle on Saturday morning. The attendant couldn't be certain it was Stephen, but the description matched, and the timing seemed right. This sighting led investigators to focus their search on the area around Robert Coldwell's auto repair shop, though at the time, they had no specific reason to suspect Coldwell of any wrongdoing. When Deputy Martinez visited Coldwell's repair shop on Tuesday afternoon, the mechanic seemed cooperative and helpful. Coldwell told Martinez that he remembered a young man coming by on Saturday morning asking about bicycle repairs, but he claimed that he had been too busy with a car repair to help the teenager. According to Coldwell's account, the young man had left after being told that the shop didn't typically work on bicycles. Coldwell's story seemed plausible, and Martinez had no reason at the time to doubt the mechanic's version of events. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Stephen Johnson expanded beyond Mobile County. Investigators contacted police departments in neighboring counties and states, wondering if Stephen might have hitchhiked somewhere or been taken across state lines. They checked bus stations and truck stops, hoping to find someone who had seen Stephen or could provide information about his whereabouts. Missing person flyers with Stephen's photograph were distributed throughout Alabama and into Mississippi and Florida. Margaret Johnson became the driving force behind the search for her son. She organized volunteer search parties, coordinated with local media to keep Stephen's story in the news, and personally followed up on every tip and lead that came in. She spent her weekends driving through rural areas of Alabama, showing Stephen's photograph to anyone who would look at it. She contacted psychics, private investigators, and anyone else who claimed they might be able to help find her missing son. The investigation took on new urgency when Stephen's bicycle was discovered 3 weeks after his disappearance. A fisherman found the bicycle partially submerged in a creek about 2 miles from Robert Coldwell's repair shop. The discovery location was significant because it suggested that Stephen had indeed made it to the area around the repair shop, contradicting any theories that he had disappeared from somewhere else in the county. When investigators examined the bicycle, they found that the chain problem Stephen had set out to fix was relatively minor. An experienced mechanic could have repaired it in a matter of minutes. This discovery led Deputy Martinez to take another, more detailed look at Robert Coldwell and his repair shop. However, a thorough search of the shop and the surrounding property turned up no additional evidence related to Stephen's disappearance. Coldwell underwent several interviews with investigators over the following months. His story remained consistent. Stephen had come to the shop asking for help. Coldwell had told him that he didn't work on bicycles, and Stephen had left. Coldwell couldn't explain how Stephen's bicycle had ended up in the creek, and he expressed sympathy for the Johnson family's situation. Without physical evidence connecting Coldwell to Stephen's disappearance, investigators had no grounds to arrest him or obtain a search warrant for a more intensive examination of his property. By the end of 1978, the Stephen Johnson case had grown cold. Deputy Martinez had followed up on dozens of leads, conducted countless interviews, and coordinated extensive search efforts, but Stephen remained missing. The case file remained open, but active investigation efforts were scaled back as other, more recent cases demanded attention. The 1980s and 90s were decades of relentless hope and crushing disappointment for Margaret Johnson. Every few months, the Mobile County Sheriff's Department would receive a tip about Stephen's case. Someone would claim to have seen him in another state, or a body would be discovered somewhere in the region that might match Stephen's description. Each time, Margaret would allow herself to hope that this might finally be the break that would bring her son home, or at least provide answers about what had happened to him. Margaret's dedication to finding Stephen became legendary in Mobile County. She never missed an opportunity to talk about her son's case with reporters, investigators, or anyone else who would listen. She attended conferences on missing persons, connected with other families dealing with similar tragedies, and became an advocate for improved investigation techniques and resources for missing person cases. Her bedroom wall was covered with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and notes related to Stephen's disappearance. Robert Coldwell continued operating his auto repair shop throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. Occasionally, investigators would revisit his shop when new leads emerged in Stephen's case, but Coldwell's story never changed. He maintained his innocence and expressed sympathy for the Johnson family. To most people in the community, Coldwell seemed like a hard-working mechanic who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Stephen Johnson disappeared. However, those closest to the investigation noticed subtle changes in Coldwell's behavior over the years. He became increasingly reclusive, rarely participating in community events or social activities. His business remained steady, but several customers commented that Coldwell seemed nervous or agitated when Stephen Johnson's case was mentioned in conversation. Some investigators wondered if Coldwell's behavior indicated guilt, but without concrete evidence, their suspicions remained just that. The advancement of forensic science during the 1990s offered new hope for cold cases like Stephen's. DNA testing became more sophisticated and accessible, allowing investigators to re-examine evidence that had been collected years or even decades earlier. Margaret Johnson regularly contacted the sheriff's department, asking if new scientific techniques could be applied to her son's case. Unfortunately, the physical evidence in Stephen's case was limited to his bicycle, and initial forensic examinations had not yielded any useful DNA evidence. In 2003, 25 years after Stephen's disappearance, the Mobile County Sheriff's Department established a cold case unit specifically dedicated to reviewing unsolved crimes from previous decades. Detective Michael Santos was assigned to head the unit, and the Stephen Johnson case was among the first files he reviewed in detail. Santos brought fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques to cases that had been stalled for years. Detective Santos's review of the Stephen Johnson file revealed several areas where the original investigation could be enhanced using modern methods. He ordered new forensic examinations of Stephen's bicycle, hoping that improved DNA testing might reveal evidence that had been missed in previous analyses. He also began conducting new interviews with people who had been involved in the original investigation, including witnesses, family members, and persons of interest. When Santos interviewed Robert Coldwell in 2004, he noticed that the mechanic seemed more nervous and evasive than previous investigators had described. Coldwell's story remained the same, but Santos observed subtle inconsistencies in the way Coldwell described the timeline of events from April 15, 1978. These inconsistencies weren't significant enough to justify an arrest, but they reinforced Santos's suspicion that Coldwell knew more about Stephen's disappearance than he had admitted. Margaret Johnson, now in her 70s, had never given up hope of finding answers about Stephen's fate. When Detective Santos took over the case, she provided him with boxes of research, correspondence, and documentation that she had accumulated over the decades. Her meticulous record keeping proved invaluable to Santos as he worked to reconstruct the events of Stephen's disappearance and the subsequent investigation. The break that Margaret Johnson had been praying for finally came, but not in the way anyone had expected. In 2015, 37 years after Stephen's disappearance, a construction crew working on a new housing development discovered human remains in a wooded area about 4 miles from Robert Coldwell's former repair shop. The remains were badly decomposed, but preliminary examination suggested they belonged to a young male who had been buried for several decades. Detective Santos immediately suspected that the remains might belong to Stephen Johnson. The location was consistent with the area where investigators had focused their search efforts in 1978, and the estimated age and gender of the remains matched Stephen's profile. However, conclusive identification would require DNA testing, and that process would take several weeks to complete. Margaret Johnson was 78 years old when Detective Santos called to tell her about the discovery of the remains. After 37 years of uncertainty, she was finally going to learn what had happened to her son. The DNA analysis of the remains discovered in 2015 confirmed what Detective Santos and Margaret Johnson had hoped and feared: the bones belonged to Stephen Johnson. After 37 years of uncertainty, the Johnson family finally knew that Stephen was dead and approximately where he had been killed. However, the discovery of Stephen's remains was only the beginning of a new phase of the investigation. Detective Santos now had to determine who had killed Stephen and buried his body in those woods. The forensic examination of Stephen's remains revealed crucial evidence that would transform the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide prosecution. Along with Stephen's bones, investigators discovered fragments of clothing and, most importantly, several strands of hair that did not belong to Stephen. These hair samples had been preserved by the unique soil conditions in the burial site, and they contained intact root follicles that could provide DNA evidence. Detective Santos submitted the hair samples for DNA analysis, hoping to identify Stephen's killer through the combined DNA index system, known as CODIS. This national database contains DNA profiles from convicted criminals, crime scene evidence, and other forensic samples collected by law enforcement agencies across the country. If Stephen's killer had ever been arrested for another crime and provided a DNA sample, there was a chance that the hair evidence could lead to an identification. While waiting for the DNA results, Santos intensified his investigation of Robert Coldwell. The mechanic was now 79 years old and had closed his repair shop several years earlier due to failing health. Santos discovered that Coldwell had been arrested twice in the decades following Stephen's disappearance, once for assault in 1991 and once for drunk driving in 2007. Both arrests had required Coldwell to provide DNA samples that were entered into the CODIS database. The DNA comparison results came back in March of 2016, nearly a year after Stephen's remains had been discovered. The hair found with Stephen's body was a perfect match for Robert Coldwell's DNA profile in the CODIS system. After 38 years, Detective Santos finally had the evidence he needed to prove that Coldwell had killed Stephen Johnson. Santos obtained an arrest warrant for Robert Coldwell and took him into custody at his home on April 14, 2016, one day before the 38th anniversary of Stephen's disappearance. Coldwell initially maintained his innocence, repeating the same story he had told investigators for decades. However, when confronted with the DNA evidence, Coldwell's resolve began to crumble. During his interrogation, Coldwell finally admitted that he had killed Stephen Johnson. According to Coldwell's confession, Stephen had come to his repair shop on April 15, 1978, asking for help with his bicycle chain. Coldwell had attempted to sexually assault Stephen, and when Stephen fought back and threatened to report the assault, Coldwell had killed him with a wrench. Coldwell had then buried Stephen's body in the woods and disposed of the bicycle in the creek where it was later found. The confession provided closure for many of the questions that had haunted the Stephen Johnson case for decades, but it also revealed the senseless nature of Stephen's murder. A promising young man's life had been cut short because he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, seeking help from someone who turned out to be a predator. Margaret Johnson was 80 years old when she learned that her son's killer had finally been identified and arrested. The news brought her a mixture of relief and profound sadness. Relief that she finally knew what had happened to Stephen, and that his killer would face justice, but sadness that it had taken 38 years and that she had spent most of her adult life not knowing her son's fate. Robert Coldwell was charged with murder in the first degree and kidnapping. Given his age and the decades that had passed since the crime, prosecutors offered him a plea agreement that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for a guilty plea. Coldwell accepted the plea agreement and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in custody in 2018. Just 2 years after his arrest, the Stephen Johnson case became a landmark example of how advances in forensic science can solve cold cases that seemed hopeless. The microscopic hair evidence that solved the case had been present at the crime scene for nearly 4 decades, but the technology needed to analyze it effectively hadn't existed when Stephen first disappeared. Detective Santos credited the case's resolution to the persistence of Margaret Johnson, the dedication of multiple generations of investigators, and the power of modern DNA analysis. Margaret Johnson lived to see her son's killer brought to justice, but she passed away in 2019, just 3 years after Coldwell's arrest. She had spent 41 years seeking answers about Stephen's disappearance, and she finally found the peace she had been seeking. Stephen's case remains a testament to the importance of never giving up hope, and the incredible advances that forensic science has made in solving crimes that once seemed impossible to resolve.